Welcome back, everybody, to the deep dive. Ready to dive into another fascinating paper with me today?
Always.
Great. So today we're tackling something pretty central to AI. How do neural networks actually learn? We always hear about algorithms and data sets, but what's actually happening inside, like inside the brain of a network as it's learning?
Yeah.
That's kind of what we're diving into today. And we have a really, really fascinating paper to guide us.
Yeah. We've got Fokker-Planck to Callan-Symanzik, evolution of weight matrices under training.
Okay.
It might sound a little intimidating, but I promise it's really interesting stuff.
Okay, I'm ready to be intimidated.
All right.
So the paper, it really zeroes in on this idea of weight matrices.
Right.
Can you remind us what those are?
Weight matrices are essentially the connections between the neurons in a neural network. So they determine how input data gets transformed as it passes through the network.
Okay, so like if we zoom in on the network and we're not looking at the whole thing as a whole, we can actually see these individual weight matrices.
Exactly.
Okay, cool. But I'm having trouble like picturing them. They're just numbers, right? So how do we actually visualize these things?
Well, there are two really helpful ways to think about weight matrices that the researchers offer in this paper. The first is to imagine all the numbers in a weight matrix as if they were drawn from a single probability distribution.
Okay.
So maybe they're clustered around an average value with some outliers, and you can picture this as a bell curve, a Gaussian distribution sometimes.
So instead of just a jumble of numbers, we start to see like a pattern emerge.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then the second way to visualize weight matrices is to think about the dimensions of the matrix.
Okay.
So let's say you have a matrix that's 200 rows and 2 columns. You could picture that as like 200 points scattered on a 2D plane.
Okay.
And this helps us kind of visualize how the matrix would act on the data that it's processing.
Okay, cool. So we can kind of think about weight matrices as either a distribution of numbers or as like points in space, basically. But how do they actually change as a network learns? Like what's happening to those numbers or those points?
Well, that's where things get really cool, I think. The paper models the evolution of a weight matrix during training using a stochastic differential equation.
Oh, yeah.
And it might sound a little intimidating, but essentially what it's doing is describing how the weights in that matrix change in response to the training data, but also in response to some random fluctuations.
Random fluctuations. Why would we factor those in?
Well, the authors of the paper argue that it's like recognizing that there are always going to be these unforeseen factors in the learning process, things that we can't perfectly control or predict.
Yeah.
And they call this diffusion, and it acts as this kind of counterforce to the optimization process.
So it's like there's a push and a pull, kind of.
Exactly, yeah. You've got drift, which is the guiding hand of the optimizer, kind of nudging those weights towards values that minimize the network's errors.
Yeah.
And then you have this diffusion that introduces a bit of randomness, which is kind of shaking things up a bit.
Okay, so it's not just like a straightforward march towards perfection. There's a little bit of wiggle room there. I'm starting to see why we need these, these stochastic differential equations.
Yeah.
But how do we actually see this happening? Like, how can we track what's happening to those weight matrix distributions as training is going on?
That's where the Fokker-Planck equation comes in. So this equation describes how that probability distribution, the shape we talked about earlier, how it actually changes over time. And it captures the interplay between that drift toward optimization and the random fluctuations from diffusion.
Oh, okay. Wait, isn't the Fokker-Planck equation something that you normally see in physics? What's it doing in an AI paper?
That's one of the things that I think is so cool about this paper. They're actually drawing this connection between the mathematics of neural networks and like the way that certain physical systems behave. Yeah. In fact, they show that this equation can be related to something called the Kardar-Parisi-Zhang equation, which is used to model things like surface growth in physics.
Oh, wow. So we're seeing neural network training through like the lens of physics, kind of.
Yeah. Kind of.
Okay, my mind is officially blown. But what does that actually tell us about the network? Like, can we predict how a network is going to learn based on this connection?
Well, that's the big question, right? And the paper makes some pretty interesting suggestions about that. So they derive another equation, the Callan-Symanzik equation, from their analysis of the weight matrix evolution. And this equation typically shows up in quantum field theory.
Wait, quantum field theory?
Yeah.
That's like subatomic particles and things, right?
Yeah.
What does that have to do with neural networks?
I know it seems like a huge leap. But what's really fascinating is that the Callan-Symanzik equation in this context describes how the network changes as training goes on.
Okay.
And it reveals points where the weight matrix distribution becomes something called scale invariant.
Scale invariant, what does that mean?
Basically, it means that the weight matrix distribution reaches this sort of stable point where training it longer doesn't really change its shape significantly.
Okay, so it's like the network has hit this plateau in its learning, kind of.
Right, exactly.
And that's not necessarily a bad thing, right?
Right. It could actually be a good thing because it suggests that the network has kind of found this really solid configuration. And to actually test out these ideas, the researchers applied it to a really simple neural network called an autoencoder.
Okay, why an autoencoder? What's special about those?
Well, autoencoders are really great for this kind of research because they force a network to learn a compressed representation of the data.
Okay.
So it's like squeezing a complex image down into a simpler code and then trying to reconstruct the original image from that code.
So it's simplifying things to make the analysis more manageable.
Exactly. Yeah. By looking at the data in this kind of compressed form, we can actually see more clearly how those weight matrices are transforming information.
Okay, that makes sense. So they have their theoretical framework, they have this simplified network to test it on.
Right.
What happened when they actually ran the simulations? Did the predictions match up with reality?
Well, that's what's really encouraging about this paper. They actually simulated the evolution of the weight matrix distribution using the Fokker-Planck equation, and they compared that to what actually happened during training.
Okay.
And guess what? They found a pretty strong correlation.
So it's not just this abstract idea. It actually seems to be reflecting what's happening inside the network. That's pretty impressive.
Yeah.
But how does all this apply to more complex neural networks, the ones that are being used for like image recognition and natural language processing and all that really cool stuff?
Yeah, well, that's the next big frontier, right? And it's definitely a challenge. I mean, right now, this research focused mainly on like individual weight matrices in isolation.
Yeah.
But in a real world neural network, you have all of these matrices interconnected. It's like a whole web of interactions.
It's like they've studied the individual instruments in an orchestra, but not how they all play together, like the whole symphony.
Yeah, that's a perfect analogy.
Yeah.
And so understanding how those different layers interact, how that information is actually flowing and transforming through the whole network, that's a really big hurdle.
Yeah.
And you can imagine as the number of layers and the number of connections increases, that math gets way more complicated.
Right.
And that's kind of what's known as the curse of dimensionality.
The curse of dimensionality.
Yeah.
That sounds kind of scary. What is that exactly?
So remember how we were talking about visualizing those weight matrices as points in space?
Yeah.
So as the number of dimensions increases, so as the data and the network get more complex, it becomes really, really difficult to work with and visualize those probability distributions.
So it's like trying to map a galaxy instead of a small town. Like it's just way too much information to try and get your head around.
Exactly, yeah. The amount of data and the computational power you would need to accurately represent those high-dimensional distributions is just immense.
So it sounds like there are some pretty big obstacles that this research is facing. Like one is figuring out how to deal with this curse of dimensionality. And the other is understanding how the different layers in these complex networks interact with each other. Are there any other limitations they ran into?
Well, one of the other things they talk about in the paper is the importance of initial conditions.
Okay.
So it turns out that even small changes in the starting values of those weight matrices can actually lead to really different learning trajectories for the network.
So it's like the butterfly effect, but for AI.
Right.
Like a tiny flutter of a weight here, a little adjustment there, and suddenly the whole network is evolving in a completely different direction.
Exactly, yeah. It really highlights just how sensitive these systems are and how much they depend on that starting point.
So how do they even find the right starting point? Is it just like a guessing game?
Not entirely. There's a whole field of research called hyperparameter optimization that's actually dedicated to finding the best settings for these initial values.
Okay.
It's kind of like fine-tuning that starting point to give the network its best chance of success.
Okay, so they're not just throwing darts in the dark. There's like an actual science behind it.
Right.
But even with these limitations, the potential of this research seems pretty huge.
Yeah.
Like, what are some of the most promising avenues for future research in this area?
Well, one thing that would be really exciting is to develop more sophisticated mathematical tools that can actually handle the complexity of those interconnected layers. We might even need to go beyond traditional differential equations and explore concepts from like network theory or statistical mechanics to capture the real intricate dynamics that are at play.
So it's not just about like crunching numbers. It's about like developing new ways of thinking about these systems, it sounds like.
Absolutely. We need to find the right language, the right concepts to understand how artificial intelligence is learning and adapting.
It's like we're trying to decode this hidden language, like the language of how AI evolves.
Exactly, yeah. And like with any language, there are these layers of meaning, nuances, and patterns to unravel. It's a fascinating challenge, and it could completely change the way we develop and interact with AI.
Speaking of interacting with AI, I was curious about their choice to use autoencoders in their experiments. You mentioned before that they used a specific type that kind of forces the data through this two-dimensional bottleneck layer.
Right.
What's the significance of that?
Well, remember when we were talking about visualizing those weight matrix distributions as scatter plots?
Yeah.
Well, by actually compressing that data down to just 2 dimensions, they could very clearly see how that distribution was changing over time as the network was learning.
So it's a strategic simplification to make the analysis more manageable, kind of like creating a zoomed-in view of a tiny part of this vast landscape.
Exactly, yeah. If they had used a higher dimensional bottleneck, those plots would have been like incredibly difficult to interpret. So by keeping it 2-dimensional, they could actually see the shape of that distribution evolve.
Okay, that makes sense. But did they only look at the weight matrices in that bottleneck layer, or did they look at others too?
They actually examined the output data distributions of both of those bottleneck layers.
Okay.
And they compared those distributions to the ones that were produced by the theoretically evolved weight matrices using the Fokker-Planck equation.
Oh, okay. So they're not just looking at the matrices themselves. They're actually looking at the impact those matrices are having on the actual data flowing through the network.
Right, exactly. And they use these things called metrics, like the mean squared error and the Pearson correlation, to actually quantify how similar those theoretical and empirical distributions were.
Okay, so they have a way to actually measure how well their predictions are lining up with what's happening in the network.
Right.
And what did those measurements tell them?
Well, they found a pretty strong correlation between the two, especially as training went on, which suggests that their theoretical model is capturing something pretty fundamental about how weight matrices are evolving.
So we have this really interesting theoretical framework, and it seems to be backed up by some empirical evidence.
Yeah.
It suggests a much deeper level of understanding and control over how these neural networks learn. But does all of this have any practical implications? Can it actually help us build better AI systems?
Absolutely. I mean, one of the most exciting possibilities is that we could actually use this to optimize the training process.
Okay.
So right now, training these neural networks, it can be really time-consuming. It can be very resource-intensive.
Right. It's basically just trial and error to figure out how long to train a network for, right?
Yeah, basically.
Okay.
But if we could use these equations to predict when the network's going to reach that scale invariant state, when it's essentially stopped learning significantly, we could potentially save a ton of time and computing power.
So instead of training blindly, we would know exactly when to stop and make the whole process more efficient.
Exactly. We could train networks more effectively, only using the resources we absolutely need to reach that optimal learning point.
That would be huge for AI development.
Yeah.
And I imagine that would have ripple effects across, so many different industries that are using AI these days. But could it also lead to better quality AI systems too?
That's another really exciting possibility. I mean, if we understand how those weight matrices are evolving, we might be able to design networks that are less prone to things like overfitting, where the network learns the training data too well, and then it can't really generalize to new information.
So it's not just about speed, it's also about creating more robust and more reliable AI systems too.
Exactly, yeah. It's about taking this more principled approach to AI development, one that's grounded in this deeper understanding of the math behind it.
Speaking of the math behind it, I have to admit I'm still a little mystified by how they actually put these equations into practice. Like, how do they implement this in their simulations? Because it sounds really complex.
Yeah, they had to develop some pretty creative numerical methods to actually solve those differential equations, especially the Fokker-Planck equation, which, describes how that probability density function changes over time. You can't just plug that into a calculator.
So they had to get clever with their coding.
Definitely, yeah. They had to break the problem down into smaller, more manageable pieces that the computer could actually handle, kind of like approximating this complex curve with a series of straight lines.
So they found a way to simplify the problem without losing too much accuracy.
Exactly.
But I imagine it still requires a massive amount of computing power especially as those distributions get more complex.
Absolutely. Yeah, and actually developing algorithms that can handle those high-dimensional calculations efficiently is still a big challenge.
Yeah.
It's this constant back and forth between the theoretical insights and the computational advancements.
Well, it sounds like this research is a great example of the kind of fundamental work that's paving the way for these really big breakthroughs in AI.
Absolutely. And, one of the most intriguing questions for me is, can we actually use these equations to predict how a network is going to learn even before we start training it?
That'd be amazing. Like, imagine being able to design a neural network and already know how it's going to perform, how long it will take to train, what kind of results you can expect.
It would be a complete game changer. We could move from this trial and error approach to this much more principled and efficient design process.
Yeah, it's almost like having a blueprint for building a mind, like this set of equations that reveal the secrets of artificial intelligence. And the fact that these equations come from physics, that just blows my mind. It hints at this really deep connection between the physical world and the world of, like, information processing.
Yeah, it's a connection that we're really just beginning to explore, and I think there are a lot more surprises in store for us.
Yeah. It really is mind-blowing to think that the same equations that describe, subatomic particles could also be the key to understanding AI. Makes you wonder, like, what other connections are out there between these seemingly unrelated fields?
Right.
But before we get too carried away with the philosophical implications, I want to hear a little bit more about, like, the specifics of their experimental setup. Like, what kind of data did they use to test their theories?
So they focused on this data set called MNIST, which is this classic collection of handwritten digits.
Okay.
It's a really common benchmark for testing new AI ideas because it's, pretty well studied. It's relatively simple.
Oh, MNIST, like the hello world of image recognition.
Yeah, exactly.
A good starting point.
Yeah.
So they fed these handwritten digits into their autoencoder and watched how those weight matrices evolved.
Exactly. And remember we were talking about how they used that two-dimensional bottleneck layer?
Yes.
That was really key for actually being able to visualize this whole process. So they created these scatter plots where each point represented like a row of the weight matrix, and they could actually see how those points were shifting and clustering as the network learned.
So they were literally watching the network's brain change in real time.
Kinda, yeah.
That's so cool.
Yeah, it's pretty neat.
And those changes, those shifts in the distribution, were they, like, consistent with what their equations predicted?
That's what's so exciting. They found a really strong correlation between the simulations that they ran based on the Fokker-Planck equation and the actual evolution of those weight matrices.
It's not just theoretical. It's actually grounded in, like, real-world evidence.
Exactly.
That's a pretty powerful combination.
Yeah. And, while they focused on this simplified network for this particular study, these findings could have some pretty big implications for much larger, more complex AI systems down the road.
For sure. So speaking of implications, let's bring it back to the big picture for a second. We've covered a lot of ground today, from weight matrices and probability distributions to equations borrowed from physics. What are some of the key takeaways you think our listeners should really hold on to?
Well, I think one of the biggest takeaways is that there's this kind of hidden order to the way that neural networks actually learn. They're not just these random black boxes.
Right.
There are these underlying mathematical principles that we can use to understand their behavior.
And those principles, like, can be described using equations that we're really just beginning to understand, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like, we're peeling back the layers of this really complex puzzle.
Absolutely.
And the Fokker-Planck equation, the Callan-Symanzik equation, these are really powerful tools, and they could help unlock even more secrets about how these networks are evolving and learning.
Yeah, and as we deepen our understanding of these equations, it just opens up this whole new world of possibilities, I think, for designing, like more efficient AI, more robust AI, maybe even more intelligent AI.
Right.
It's like we're moving from this world of AI alchemy to a world of AI engineering,
Yeah.
where we actually have the blueprints and the tools to create these really incredible things.
Yeah, it's a really exciting time to be working in this field. And I think this research is just the tip of the iceberg. There's still so much more to discover.
Well, I'm really excited to see where this all leads. It's been a fantastic deep dive. And I want to thank you for, walking us through these really complex concepts with such clarity and enthusiasm.
Oh, it's been my pleasure.
And to our listeners,
Yeah.
stay curious, keep learning, and keep asking those questions. The future of AI is full of possibilities, and it's up to all of us to help shape it.
Yeah.
So on that note, we're going to wrap up this episode of The Deep Dive. We hope you enjoyed this exploration of, this hidden world of neural networks. Until next time, keep diving deep into the fascinating world of knowledge.